Marcus Chen's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. on the 14th of November 2019, the same as it did every weekday morning. He slept through the first buzz but woke on the second, reaching over to silence it before it could wake his wife Elena or their 4-year-old daughter Lily, who sometimes crawled into their bed in the early hours. The routine was so ingrained that Marcus could have done it with his eyes closed. Shower, coffee, toast with peanut butter, kiss Elena goodbye while she was still half asleep, check on Lily in her room decorated with drawings of purple dinosaurs, then out the door by 6:15 a.m. to start his shift at the FedEx depot in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Marcus had been driving the same delivery route for 3 years. It wasn't glamorous work, but he took pride in it. The route covered the rural communities sprawling out from Cedar Falls, a patchwork of farmland, gravel roads, and isolated homes where neighbors knew each other by first name and everyone waved at passing trucks. Marcus knew every turn, every pothole, every house where a dog would sprint out barking at his tires. He knew which customers liked to chat and which ones preferred to sign quickly and get back inside. He knew Mrs. Patterson on Elm Ridge Road always offered him homemade cookies, and he knew the Kowalski farm had a gate that stuck and needed an extra shove to close properly. People in Cedar Falls liked Marcus. He was punctual, friendly, never in too much of a hurry to ask how someone's day was going. He remembered names, remembered birthdays, remembered when the Hendersons' youngest son left for college and asked how he was adjusting. It was the kind of quiet reliability that made him fade into the background of daily life, the type of person you didn't think about until suddenly he wasn't there anymore. On the morning of November 14, Marcus clocked in at 6:47 a.m. His supervisor, a man named Greg Tolliver, who had worked at the depot for 16 years, would later tell police that Marcus seemed completely normal. No complaints, no distractions, no indication anything was wrong. Marcus loaded his truck with 47 packages, checked his scanner, reviewed his route on the GPS system, and pulled out of the depot at 7:23 a.m. It was overcast, temperature hovering around 38 degrees, the kind of gray November day that hinted at the long Iowa winter ahead. The day proceeded without incident. Marcus made his deliveries on schedule, scanning each package, collecting signatures where required, leaving notes when no one answered the door. At 3:12 p.m., he texted Elena, "Running on time, should be home by 7. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji and a reminder to pick up milk on the way. He sent back a quick, "Got it," and continued working. By 6 p.m., darkness had settled over the farmland. November evenings in Iowa come fast and cold, the sun disappearing behind flat horizons and leaving behind a thick, pressing darkness that seems to swallow sound. Marcus had 8 deliveries confirmed by dispatch, 8 packages scanned, 8 customers satisfied, 8 small interactions that constituted a normal workday. He had 1 package left, a birthday gift, addressed to the Holloway Farm on County Road 47, a road Marcus had driven hundreds of times. County Road 47 was narrow, flanked on both sides by cornfields that had been harvested weeks earlier, leaving behind rows of jagged stubble stretching into the darkness. There were no streetlights out there, no houses visible from the road, just the occasional mailbox marking the long driveways that led back to farmhouses set far from the pavement. The Holloway property sat a quarter-mile off the road, accessible by a gravel drive that wound through their land. At 6:47 p.m., Marcus's GPS tracker registered his location on County Road 47, approximately 2 miles from the Holloway farm entrance. Dispatch recorded the ping automatically, a small digital breadcrumb that meant nothing at the time. Then the signal went dead. Not lost, not weakened dead. The GPS stopped transmitting entirely, as if Marcus's truck had simply ceased to exist. When Marcus didn't return to the depot by 8 p.m., Greg Tolliver wasn't immediately concerned. Delays happened, especially on rural routes, where a brief conversation could stretch into 20 minutes or a missed turn could add 30 minutes to a trip. By 8:30 p.m., Tolliver tried calling Marcus's phone. It rang but went to voicemail. He tried again at 8:45 p.m., same result. At 9 p.m., Elena called the depot, her voice tight with worry. Marcus hadn't come home. He wasn't answering his phone. This wasn't like him. He always called if he was running late. Always. Tolliver assured her it was probably nothing. Maybe his phone died. Maybe he had truck trouble and was waiting for a tow. But the unease in his own gut was growing. He called dispatch, requested the last known GPS location, and was told County Road 47 at 6:47 p.m., then nothing. Tolliver called the Cedar Falls Police Department at 9:23 p.m. and reported a missing employee. The dispatcher took down the information and said they'd send a patrol car to check the route. Officer Danny Reeves found the truck at 11:47 p.m. It was parked on the narrow shoulder of County Road 47, hazard lights off, driver's door hanging open. The headlights were off, but the keys were still in the ignition, turned to the accessory position. Marcus's phone sat on the driver's seat, screen dark, battery at 12%. His scanner was on the passenger seat. The ninth package, the birthday gift for the Holloways, sat untouched in the back of the truck, exactly where Marcus had loaded it that morning. Reeves stepped out of his patrol car, flashlight cutting through the darkness, and called out. His voice disappeared into the empty fields. There was no response, no movement, no sound except the wind rattling through the dried corn stubble. He walked around the truck, checking for signs of an accident, a struggle, anything that might explain why a driver would abandon his vehicle in the middle of nowhere. The gravel shoulder showed no skid marks. The truck's exterior was clean, undamaged. There was no blood inside the cab, no torn clothing, no evidence of violence. Everything was in place except Marcus Chen himself. Reeves radioed for backup, and within an hour, County Road 47 was lit up with patrol cars and emergency vehicles. Officers walked the roadside with flashlights, calling Marcus's name into the darkness. They searched the ditches, checked the fields immediately adjacent to the truck, looked for any sign of where he might have gone. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. If Marcus was out there injured or disoriented, time was critical. By 1:30 a.m., Elena arrived at the scene, her face pale and drawn, her hands shaking as she spoke to the responding sergeant. She told him Marcus had no reason to leave, no mental health issues, no financial problems, no fights or arguments. They'd been married for 6 years, together for 8. He was a devoted father who read bedtime stories to Lily every night he was home. He loved his job, loved their quiet life in Cedar Falls. This didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Sergeant Tom Wyatt, a 22-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, listened carefully and assured Elena they were doing everything possible. But privately, standing on that dark road with an abandoned truck and no answers, Wyatt felt the cold knot of dread that came with cases like this. No signs of struggle usually meant voluntary disappearance, but everything about Marcus Chen's life suggested a man with no reason to vanish. No medical emergency made sense because his phone was right there, unused. No animal attack explained the lack of blood or disturbance. No mechanical failure accounted for the keys still in the ignition. As dawn broke over the cornfields on November 15, search teams began to arrive. Volunteers from Cedar Falls, neighboring counties, and the Iowa Search and Rescue Organization spread out across the farmland surrounding County Road 47. They walked in grid patterns through the harvested fields, calling Marcus's name, looking for any trace of him. Canine units were brought in, bloodhounds trained to track human scent. The dogs picked up Marcus's trail immediately, following it from the driver's seat of the truck, across the gravel shoulder, and into the cornfield adjacent to where the truck had been found. The handlers followed, watching as the dogs moved with purpose, noses low, tails focused. They tracked the scent for approximately 200 feet into the field, weaving slightly through the stubble, and then stopped. Not gradually, not with the typical signs of a lost trail, but abruptly. The dogs circled, whined, searched the immediate area with increasing confusion, but the scent was gone. One of the handlers, a woman named Carol Dempsey who had worked search and rescue for 14 years, told Sergeant Wyatt she'd never seen anything like it. Scent trails fade, they dissipate, they get confused by weather or contamination, but they don't just vanish. It was as if Marcus had been lifted into the air and carried away. The search continued for days. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew over the farmland, looking for any heat signature that might indicate a body. Divers checked nearby ponds and creeks, though Marcus had no known connection to those areas. Investigators interviewed everyone along his route, Everyone who had received a package that day. Everyone who might have seen something, anything, that could explain what happened. The Holloways, the intended recipients of that final undelivered package, told police they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual that evening. They'd been inside watching television, their property set far enough back from the road that they wouldn't have noticed a truck passing by. Cedar Falls was a town of just over 40,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knew someone who knew someone else. News of Marcus's disappearance spread fast, and the community responded with a mixture of fear and solidarity. Flyers with Marcus's face went up in every storefront, every community board, every church bulletin. Elena appeared at a press conference on November 18, 4 days after Marcus vanished, her voice breaking as she begged for information. She held up a photo of Marcus and Lily together, his arms wrapped around their daughter, both of them smiling. She asked anyone who knew anything, saw anything, heard anything, to please come forward. She said Lily kept asking when Daddy was coming home, and she didn't know what to tell her anymore. Theories emerged, as they always do when someone disappears without explanation. Some people suggested Marcus had suffered a sudden medical emergency, a stroke or seizure that caused him to wander into the fields, disoriented. But medical experts pointed out that even in cases of severe disorientation, bodies are usually found within a relatively short radius, and the search had covered miles. Others speculated about foul play, though there was no evidence of it and no apparent motive. Marcus had no enemies, no debts, no secret life that anyone could uncover. A few whispered about voluntary disappearance, suggesting maybe Marcus had wanted to escape, but everyone who knew him dismissed that immediately. He wasn't the type. He loved his family. He loved his life. As November gave way to December, the active search was scaled back. Volunteers couldn't sustain the daily efforts, and professional search teams had exhausted the most likely areas. Snow began to fall, covering the cornfields in a blanket of white that would remain until spring. The case remained open, the investigation ongoing, but the chances of finding Marcus alive diminished with each passing day. Elena returned home to face the impossible task of explaining to a 4-year-old girl why her father wasn't coming back. At least not yet. Maybe not ever. The last confirmed sighting of Marcus Chen was on the grainy security footage from a gas station 11 miles from County Road 47, captured at 6:15 p.m. on November 14. He was filling up his truck, checking his phone, looking completely normal. 32 minutes later, he was gone, swallowed by the November darkness and the empty fields that stretched endlessly in all directions, leaving behind only questions and a truck with the door still open, as if he'd intended to return at any moment. Detective Sarah Brennan arrived at the Cedar Falls Police Department at 6 a.m. on November 15, 3 hours after Marcus Chen's truck had been found abandoned on County Road 47. She'd been woken by a call from Sergeant Wyatt at 4:30 a.m., his voice carrying the kind of urgency that meant something was seriously wrong. Brennan had 15 years of experience in missing persons cases, enough to know that the first 48 hours were everything. After that, the statistics turned grim, the possibilities narrowed, and hope began its slow, painful erosion. She stood in the department's conference room as Wyatt briefed her on what they knew, which wasn't much. A delivery driver, 29 years old, married with a young daughter, vanished sometime after 6:47 p.m. the previous evening. Truck found with keys in the ignition, phone on the seat, no signs of struggle. Search teams were already combing the area, but so far they'd found nothing. Brennan listened, taking notes, her mind already working through the possibilities. Medical emergency, abduction, voluntary disappearance, accident. She'd seen all of them before, and each left distinct patterns. The trick was figuring out which pattern you were looking at before it was too late. By 8 a.m., Brennan was standing next to Marcus's truck on County Road 47, watching forensic technicians photograph every angle, dust for prints, catalog every item inside the cab. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of crystalline November light that made everything look exposed and vulnerable. She walked the perimeter slowly, studying the gravel shoulder, the road surface, the field beyond. There were no skid marks, no debris, no indication that another vehicle had been involved. The truck's position suggested Marcus had simply pulled over, opened the door, and stepped out. But why? And where had he gone? The canine units arrived at 9:30 a.m., two bloodhounds and their handlers from the Iowa Search and Rescue Organization. Brennan had worked with tracking dogs before and trusted their abilities more than most technology. The dogs were given Marcus's scent from a work shirt Elena had provided, and they immediately picked up the trail from the driver's seat. Brennan followed as the handlers moved into the cornfield, watching the dogs work with focused intensity. They tracked the scent across the stubble, noses low, moving in a relatively straight line deeper into the field. At approximately 200 feet from the road, both dogs stopped. They circled the area, whining, searching with increasing agitation, but the trail was gone. Carol Dempsey, the lead handler, looked back at Brennan with an expression that conveyed both confusion and unease. She explained that scent trails could fade due to weather, wind, contamination, but this wasn't fading. This was an abrupt termination, as if Marcus had simply ceased to exist at that exact spot. Brennan stood in the middle of the cornfield, surrounded by acres of empty farmland, and felt the first cold thread of dread weave its way into her gut. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. Over the next 48 hours, Brennan conducted interviews with everyone connected to Marcus's life. She sat across from Elena in the Chen family living room, a modest home filled with photos of Marcus, Elena, and Lily smiling at various stages of their lives together. Elena was cooperative but shattered, her hands trembling as she provided phone records, bank statements, medical history, anything that might help. She told Brennan that Marcus had $847 in their joint checking account, no recent withdrawals, no unexplained expenses. His last text to her at 5:32 p.m. read, "Almost done. Be home for dinner. Love you." There was nothing in those words that suggested fear, distress, or any intention to disappear. Brennan reviewed Marcus's phone records line by line. The last call he'd made was to a customer at 4:15 p.m., confirming a delivery time. After that, only the text to Elena. No suspicious numbers, no deleted messages that forensics could recover, no apps that indicated secret communications. His social media presence was minimal, a Facebook account he rarely updated, mostly filled with photos of Lily and shares of community events. There were no hidden email accounts, no dating apps, no financial irregularities. Marcus Chen's digital life was exactly what it appeared to be: ordinary, stable, unremarkable. Brennan interviewed Marcus's co-workers at the FedEx depot. Greg Tolliver, his supervisor, described Marcus as the most reliable driver on staff. Never late, never complained, never cut corners. Other drivers echoed the sentiment. One of them, a woman named Jessica Park, who had worked alongside Marcus for 2 years, told Brennan that Marcus talked about his family constantly. He showed everyone photos of Lily's preschool drawings, bragged about how smart she was, mentioned that Elena was taking online courses to finish her nursing degree. He was proud of them. He was happy. Jessica's voice broke when she said she couldn't imagine what would make him just leave. The Holloways, the intended recipients of that final undelivered package, were interviewed at their farmhouse, a weathered 2-story structure set a quarter-mile back from County Road 47. Bill and Margaret Holloway, both in their late 60s, told Brennan they'd been home all evening on November 14, watching television, waiting for their granddaughter's birthday present to arrive. They hadn't heard anything unusual, hadn't seen any vehicles or people. Their property was surrounded by harvested cornfields, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. The isolation was striking. If something had happened to Marcus on that road, there were no witnesses, no surveillance, no one to hear or see anything. Forensic technicians spent 3 days processing Marcus's truck. They found his fingerprints from other FedEx employees who had used the vehicle on previous shifts, and nothing else. No foreign DNA, no fibers that didn't belong, no trace evidence that suggested anyone else had been inside the cab. The vehicle's mechanical systems were inspected thoroughly. Everything was functioning normally. The fuel tank was 3/4 full. The tires showed normal wear. There was no reason for Marcus to have stopped on that particular stretch of road unless he'd chosen to or been forced to. Brennan obtained surveillance footage from every business and traffic camera within a 30-mile radius. The most recent footage of Marcus came from a Shell station 11 miles from County Road 47, time-stamped at 6:15 p.m. The video showed Marcus filling up his truck, checking his phone briefly, then getting back in and driving away. He looked completely normal, calm, unhurried, no indication of distress. Traffic cameras were sparse in rural Iowa, but Brennan's team pulled every available feed from state highways and county roads. They tracked Marcus's route from the gas station toward County Road 47, but coverage ended 2 miles before the location where his truck was found. After that, nothing. By November 18, the investigation had expanded beyond local resources. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit sent 2 agents to Cedar Falls, Special Agents Reeves and Kowalski, who specialized in abduction cases. They reviewed everything Brennan had compiled and agreed the circumstances were unusual. The lack of evidence, the vanished scent trail, the complete absence of any digital or physical clues pointed toward a carefully executed abduction. But abductions typically had motives: ransom, revenge, human trafficking, sexual assault. Marcus Chen didn't fit the profile for any of those scenarios. He wasn't wealthy, had no enemies, wasn't involved in any criminal activity. The FBI agents set up a tip line and waited for a ransom demand that never came. The media descended on Cedar Falls during the 3rd week of November. The vanishing driver became a regional headline first, then spread to national news outlets. Reporters stood on County Road 47, filming segments with the empty cornfields in the background, speculating about what might have happened. The theories multiplied rapidly, each more outlandish than the last. Some people latched onto the detail about the dogs losing the scent and suggested alien abduction. Online forums dedicated to unexplained disappearances lit up with debates about extraterrestrial involvement, citing the isolated rural location and the lack of physical evidence as proof of something otherworldly. Others pointed to Iowa's position as a major drug trafficking corridor and speculated that Marcus had witnessed something he shouldn't have been mistaken for someone else or gotten caught in cartel violence. This theory gained enough traction that the FBI's Drug Enforcement Division reviewed recent cartel activity in the area, but found nothing that connected to Marcus or his route. A smaller subset of conspiracy theorists proposed witness protection, suggesting Marcus had been an informant who was relocated by federal authorities. The FBI quickly debunked this, confirming Marcus had no involvement with any law enforcement operations. Psychics called the Cedar Falls Police Department daily, offering visions and insights. One claimed Marcus was alive and being held in a basement 200 miles away. Another said he'd fallen into an abandoned well. A third insisted he'd been attacked by a wild animal and his body was hidden in the woods. Brennan followed up on every tip that had even a thread of plausibility, but none led anywhere. The well locations were searched and found empty. The basements were checked with the homeowner's permission and revealed nothing. The woods were combed by search teams and yielded no trace of Marcus. By early December, snow began to fall across Iowa, blanketing the cornfields in white and making further outdoor searches nearly impossible. The active search was officially suspended on December 8, though the investigation remained open. Brennan held a press conference to announce the suspension, carefully explaining that the case was not closed, that they would continue to pursue any leads, but that weather conditions made large-scale ground searches unfeasible until spring. She urged anyone with information to come forward, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Elena appeared on local news on December 12, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes that spoke to weeks of sleepless nights. She sat next to a photo of Marcus and Lily, her voice breaking as she spoke directly to the camera. She said that Lily still asked for her daddy every night, still expected him to come through the door. She begged anyone who knew anything, saw anything, heard anything, to please help bring Marcus home. She said her family couldn't move forward without answers, without knowing what happened. The segment aired during the evening news and was shared thousands of times on social media, but it produced no new leads. Brennan worked the case relentlessly, reviewing files late into the night, re-interviewing witnesses, searching for the details she'd missed, the connection she'd failed to make. She knew something was wrong with the evidence, or rather, wrong with the lack of evidence. People didn't just vanish. There were always clues, always traces, always something left behind. But Marcus Chen had left nothing except questions and a truck with the door still open. On Christmas Eve, Brennan sat alone in her office at the Cedar Falls Police Department, the building quiet and mostly empty. Outside, snow fell steadily, covering the town in a peaceful white blanket that felt obscene given the circumstances. She had Marcus's case file spread across her desk, photos and reports and witness statements arranged in neat stacks. She'd read every page dozens of times, memorized every detail, and still couldn't see what she was missing. The vanished scent trail haunted her. She'd consulted with tracking experts, read research papers on scent dispersion and environmental factors, tried to find any explanation for how a trail could simply end 200 feet into a field. The only scenarios that made sense involved Marcus being picked up and carried, either by a vehicle that somehow accessed the field without leaving tracks, or by a person strong enough to carry a grown man. But there was no evidence of either. No tire tracks, no footprints other than Marcus's, no disturbance in the soil. Brennan leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes, exhaustion settling into her bones. Somewhere out there, Marcus Chen was either alive or dead, and she had no way of knowing which. His family was spending Christmas without him, his daughter opening presents without her father, his wife facing an empty chair at the dinner table, and Brennan sat in her office with a stack of papers that told her nothing, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders. She thought about the text Marcus had sent Elena at 5:32 p.m. "Almost done. Be home for dinner. Love you." Those were the words of a man who expected to come home, who had no idea that within an hour he would disappear into the November darkness and leave behind only silence. Brennan closed the file, locked it in her desk drawer, and sat in the quiet office, staring at the falling snow outside her window. Something had happened on County Road 47, something that made no sense with the evidence they had. And until she figured out what that something was, Marcus Chen would remain lost, and his family would remain suspended in the unbearable limbo of not knowing. The case went cold on a date no one could pinpoint exactly. There was no official moment when the Cedar Falls Police Department closed the file on Marcus Chen, no press conference announcing the end of active investigation. It happened gradually, the way winter gives way to spring, almost imperceptible until you look back and realize everything has changed. By January 2020, the daily searches had stopped. By March, the weekly case reviews had become monthly. By summer, Marcus Chen's disappearance had become another unsolved mystery, filed away in a drawer that Detective Sarah Brennan couldn't bring herself to close completely. Elena Chen existed in a limbo that had no name, no precedent in her experience. Marcus was legally neither alive nor dead, a status that created impossible complications in the mundane machinery of daily life. She couldn't access his life insurance policy because there was no death certificate. She couldn't file for survivor benefits because there was no proof he was deceased. She couldn't remarry, not that she wanted to, but the option didn't even exist in any meaningful way. How do you move on from someone who might still be alive? How do you grieve someone who might walk through the door tomorrow? She started a Facebook group in February 2020, calling it Find Marcus Chen. It was a simple page with Marcus's photo, the details of his disappearance, and a plea for information. The group gained members slowly, friends, neighbors, people from Cedar Falls who remembered the case, true crime enthusiasts from other states who followed missing persons cases. By the end of 2020, the group had 187 members. Elena posted regularly at first, sharing memories of Marcus, updates from the police investigation when there were any theories about what might have happened. On the 14th of November 2020, the one-year anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, she posted a photo of Marcus holding Lily as a baby, both of them smiling, and wrote a message about how much they missed him, how they hadn't given up hope. The post received 43 likes and 12 comments offering support and prayers. But as 2020 became 2021 and 2021 became 2022, the engagement dwindled. People moved on because that's what people do. They have their own lives, their own problems, their own tragedies. Marcus Chen's disappearance became old news, a sad story from years ago that occasionally crossed someone's mind but didn't demand daily attention. Elena continued posting on each anniversary, each birthday, each milestone that Marcus was missing. Lily's first day of kindergarten, The Christmas when Lily stopped asking if Daddy was coming home. Marcus's 31st birthday, then his 32nd. The posts became lonelier, the comment sections quieter, until it was mostly just Elena talking into the void, refusing to let Marcus be forgotten even as the world forgot him anyway. Detective Brennan never closed the file. Not in her mind, not in any way that mattered. She revisited the case quarterly at first, pulling out the thick folder and reading through every report, every witness statement, every forensic analysis, searching for the detail she'd missed. She re-interviewed people when she could justify it, calling up Greg Tolliver at the FedEx depot, checking in with the Holloways, asking if they'd remembered anything new. They never had. She chased down tips whenever they came in, though they became increasingly rare and increasingly implausible as time passed. Someone called in April 2020 claiming they'd seen Marcus at a Walmart in Des Moines. Brennan drove there, reviewed security footage, and confirmed it wasn't him. In August 2021, a hiker reported finding a decomposed body in a state park 80 miles from Cedar Falls. Brennan responded with the county coroner and held her breath during the examination, feeling guilty about hoping it was Marcus because at least that would be an answer. It wasn't. The body belonged to a homeless man who died of exposure the previous winter. In March 2022, an anonymous tip claimed Marcus had been murdered and buried on a property in Minnesota. Brennan coordinated with Minnesota authorities, obtained a search warrant, and watched as cadaver dogs searched the property for 8 hours and found nothing. She became semi-obsessed, a fact she recognized but couldn't control. Her partner, Detective Mike Torres, a good cop and a decent man who'd worked alongside her for 7 years, started gently suggesting she let it go. They were having coffee in the department break room in June 2021 when he brought it up, his tone careful, worried about her. He said Marcus Chen's case was a tragedy, but there were other cases, other people who needed help, and she couldn't save everyone. Brennan knew he was right, knew she was spending too much mental energy on a cold case when active investigations demanded her attention, but she couldn't stop. Something about the vanished scent trail wouldn't leave her alone. She consulted with canine handlers, not just Carol Dempsey from the original search, but experts from across the Midwest. She read academic studies on scent tracking, learned about scent cones and air currents, and environmental factors that affected canine detection. One handler from Illinois, a specialist in search and rescue operations, told her that abrupt trail endings, like the one in Marcus Chen's case, typically indicated the person had been placed in a vehicle. The scent rises with the vehicle and disperses, leaving nothing for the dogs to follow. It made sense theoretically, but the truck's dash camera had been reviewed frame by frame. It faced forward and showed no other vehicles on County Road 47 for 20 minutes before Marcus's last GPS ping and 20 minutes after. The road was empty, completely empty. Brennan lay awake at night thinking about that impossibility. If Marcus had been forced into a vehicle, where did it come from? The cornfields? But there were no access roads, no tire tracks found in the subsequent searches. Could someone have approached on foot, forced Marcus into the field, then somehow transported him away? But the canine units would have picked up a second scent trail. Nothing about the evidence made sense, and the contradictions kept Brennan awake long after she should have let sleep claim her. The emotional toll spread through everyone connected to the case like a slow poison. Elena attended therapy starting in early 2020, sitting in a small office in downtown Cedar Falls with a counselor named Dr. Patricia Mills, trying to process the impossible grief of losing someone who might not be lost. She developed insomnia, lying awake in the bed she'd shared with Marcus, staring at the ceiling, her mind running through the same questions on an endless loop. Where was he? Was he alive? Did he suffer? Would they ever know? Dr. Mills prescribed antidepressants in May 2020, and they helped flatten the worst peaks of despair, but they also flattened everything else, leaving Elena moving through her days in a numb haze that felt like existence rather than living. Lily grew up in the shadow of her father's absence. By 2022, she was 8 years old enough to understand that Daddy wasn't coming back, but young enough that her memories of him were fragmenting, becoming less real with each passing year. She remembered the feeling of being held by him, remembered his voice reading bedtime stories, but couldn't quite conjure his face without looking at photos. Elena worried about this constantly, worried that Lily would forget Marcus entirely, that he would become just a collection of stories and pictures rather than a real person who'd loved her. Cedar Falls held a memorial vigil on the 14th of November 2021, the second anniversary of Marcus's disappearance. It was organized by the local Methodist Church and held in the town square, a small gathering of people holding candles and sharing prayers. Elena attended with Lily, standing in the cold November evening, surrounded by maybe 40 people, a fraction of the community that had turned out for the original searches. The pastor spoke about hope and faith and the mystery of God's plan. People hugged Elena and told her they were still praying, but the sparse attendance said what no one wanted to voice out loud. People had moved on. Life continued. Cedar Falls had other concerns, other tragedies, other needs. Life did continue, relentlessly, regardless of Marcus Chen's absence. Brennan worked other cases because crime didn't stop for unsolved mysteries. She investigated domestic violence calls, busted meth labs in rural farmhouses, responded to a drowning in the Cedar River in July 2022 when a teenager jumped off a bridge and didn't resurface. Each case demanded her full attention, her emotional energy, her investigative skills. She gave what she could, did her job competently. Closed cases. But Marcus Chen's empty truck on County Road 47 remained a ghost in her mind, haunting the edges of every other investigation, whispering that she'd failed, that she'd missed something crucial. By 2023, the case was functionally dead. The FBI had moved on years earlier, their resources allocated to active investigations with leads and suspects and possibilities. Local media didn't cover the anniversaries anymore. The last news story about Marcus Chen had aired in November 2021, a brief 2-minute segment on the second anniversary that mostly rehashed old information. The Facebook group Find Marcus Chen had 312 members, but most were inactive, the page existing in the silent space of the internet where abandoned causes went to slowly fade away. Elena had started seeing someone in spring 2023, a coworker from the hospital where she'd finally finished her nursing degree and started working. His name was David, and he was kind, patient, and understanding about the complicated grief she carried. They went to dinner sometimes, to movies, took Lily to the park. It was casual, undefined, nothing Elena could call a relationship without feeling like a fraud. But even that casual connection filled her with guilt so profound, she could barely breathe through it. She told Dr. Mills during a session in August 2023 that she felt like she was cheating on a ghost, betraying Marcus by allowing herself moments of happiness or connection with another person. Dr. Mills gently pointed out that Marcus had been gone for nearly 4 years, that Elena deserved to live her life, that Marcus would want her to be happy. Elena nodded and agreed intellectually, but couldn't make her heart believe it. October 2023 arrived with the kind of bright, crisp autumn weather that makes Iowa beautiful. The corn grew tall again in the fields surrounding Cedar Falls, the same fields where Marcus had disappeared, now replanted and harvested in the endless agricultural cycle that defined the region. Farmers worked their land, combines moving through the rows, cutting down the stalks and collecting the grain. The harvest would be good this year, people said. The weather had been favorable, the yields strong. Life continued. Elena drove past County Road 47 one afternoon in mid-October, taking a route she usually avoided because the memories were too painful. But Lily had a soccer game in a neighboring town, and County Road 47 was the most direct path. She drove slowly, her hands tight on the steering wheel, her eyes scanning the fields almost involuntarily, as if 4 years later she might suddenly spot something everyone else had missed. The road looked the same as it always had, narrow, quiet, flanked by farmland stretching to the horizon. There was no marker indicating this was where Marcus Chen had vanished, no memorial, no indication that anything unusual had ever happened here. The land remembered nothing. Lily sat in the back seat, headphones on, watching something on a tablet, oblivious to the significance of the road they were traveling. She didn't remember this place, didn't understand that her father had disappeared somewhere in these fields. She was 9 years old now, growing up, moving forward in a way Elena couldn't quite manage. Elena glanced in the rearview mirror at her daughter and felt the familiar ache of loss mixed with gratitude that Lily was resilient, adaptable, capable of building a life even with a father-sized hole in it. Brennan sat in her office that same October afternoon, reviewing a case file for an upcoming court appearance, when her mind drifted back to Marcus Chen. It happened regularly, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, unable to leave it alone despite the pain. She thought about the vanished scent trail, the empty truck, the text message that said he'd be home for dinner. She thought about Elena Chen spending 4 years in limbo, about a little girl growing up without her father, about a case that made no sense no matter how many times she reviewed the evidence. Somewhere, Marcus Chen was either alive or dead. Somewhere there was an answer. But 4 years later, sitting in her office with autumn sunlight streaming through the window, Detective Sarah Brennan had no idea where that answer might be, or if it would ever be found. The file remained open in her desk drawer, a constant reminder of the case she couldn't solve, the man she couldn't find, the family she couldn't give closure. And the corn grew tall in the fields again, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to mystery, following the same cycle it had followed for generations. The land remembered nothing, and time moved forward, relentless and uncaring. The 8th of November 2023 dawned cold and overcast, the kind of gray November morning that felt like a continuation of the previous night rather than a new day. Dale Richter woke at 5:30 a.m., the same time he'd been waking for the past 40 years, and went through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done the same tasks thousands of times. Coffee, toast, check the weather forecast, pull on his work boots and heavy canvas jacket. He was 67 years old, a third-generation corn farmer working the same land his grandfather had purchased in 1947, and he had post-harvest fieldwork to complete before the ground froze solid for winter. The harvest had been good this year. The combines had moved through his fields in late October, cutting down the corn and leaving behind rows of stubble that would need to be tilled under before spring planting. Richter fired up his John Deere tractor at 7:15 a.m. and spent the morning working the fields adjacent to County Road 47, the same fields that bordered the location where Marcus Chen's truck had been found 4 years earlier. Richter remembered that night, remembered the police vehicles and search teams, and the terrible sense that something very wrong had happened on his land. But 4 years had passed, and the corn had grown and been harvested 3 times since then, and life had moved on the way it always did in farming communities, where the land demanded attention regardless of tragedy. By 2:30 p.m., Richter was working a section of field approximately 400 feet from the road, using a rotary tiller to break up the soil and incorporate the remaining crop residue. It was routine work, mindless in the way that physical labor can be when you've done it for decades. The tiller churned through the earth, its blades cutting and mixing the soil in a consistent rhythm that Richter could hear even over the tractor's engine. Then the rhythm changed. The tiller lurched, the blades catching on something beneath the surface, and the machine jammed with a grinding sound that made Richter wince. He shut down the tractor, the sudden silence almost startling after hours of engine noise, and climbed down to investigate. It was probably rocks or old fence wire, both common obstacles in Iowa farmland where decades of agricultural use had left all kinds of debris buried in the soil. Richter walked to the back of the tiller, already thinking about how long it would take to clear the jam and get back to work, when he saw the fabric. It was caught in the tiller's blades, a strip of dark blue material that looked like it had once been part of a shirt or jacket. Richter bent down, squinting at it, and felt the first cold thread of unease work its way into his chest. The fabric was torn and dirty, but it was clearly synthetic, not the kind of natural fiber that would have decomposed completely after years in the soil. He reached down to pull it free and saw the bone. It was small, maybe 3 inches long, pale and unmistakably human. Richter stumbled backward, his hands suddenly shaking, his breath coming fast and shallow. He'd lived on this land his entire life, had seen deer bones and cattle bones and all manner of animal remains. But this was different. This was a human finger bone, and it was attached to more fabric, and there was more bone underneath, and Richter's mind was putting together a picture he didn't want to see. He pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket with trembling hands and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and Richter's voice came out rough and unsteady as he said he'd found human remains in his field off County Road 47. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line, to move away from the area, to wait for officers to arrive. Richter walked back to his tractor and sat on the step, phone pressed to his ear, staring at the disturbed soil where the tiller had unearthed something that should have stayed buried. Within 90 minutes, County Road 47 was transformed into a crime scene for the second time in 4 years. Police vehicles blocked both ends of the road, their lights flashing in the gray afternoon. Crime scene tape stretched across the field, marking off a wide perimeter around the discovery site. Officers moved with purpose, establishing a command post, coordinating the response, calling in forensic teams and the medical examiner. And the same canine units that had searched these fields 4 years earlier arrived again, their handlers grimly aware of the irony that they were returning to a location they'd already covered. Detective Sarah Brennan got the call at 3:15 p.m. She was at her desk, working through paperwork on a burglary case, when her phone rang and Sergeant Wyatt's voice said they'd found human remains on County Road 47, approximately 400 feet from where Marcus Chen's truck had been discovered. Brennan's heart lurched in her chest, a physical sensation of shock and dread and something that might have been relief. She grabbed her jacket and was out the door within 30 seconds, driving too fast toward the location she'd visited in her mind thousands of times over the past 4 years. She arrived at 3:45 p.m., parking behind the line of emergency vehicles and walking quickly across the field toward the cluster of people gathered around the excavation site. The forensic team was already working, carefully clearing soil away from the remains, photographing every step of the process, documenting the scene with meticulous precision. Brennan stood at the edge of the perimeter, watching, her mind racing through implications and questions and the terrible certainty that this was Marcus Chen. The remains were skeletal, which made sense given the 4-year timeline. They were buried roughly 18 inches deep, shallow enough that the tiller had caught them, but deep enough that they'd remained hidden through multiple growing seasons. The location was approximately 400 feet from where Marcus's truck had been found, deeper into the field than the canine units had tracked. Brennan remembered standing in almost this exact spot 4 years ago, watching the dogs lose the scent, wondering what had happened. Now she knew. Marcus had been here the entire time, buried beneath their feet while search teams combed the surrounding area. The forensic team worked until dark, setting up portable lights as the sun set and the temperature dropped into the low 30 seconds. Brennan stayed at the scene, unable to leave, watching as they carefully excavated around the skeleton, documenting the position, collecting soil samples, photographing from every angle. By 9 p.m., they'd uncovered the complete remains and the artifacts buried with them. Fragments of clothing clung to the bones, navy blue fabric consistent with a FedEx uniform. The material was degraded but identifiable, the synthetic fibers having survived better than natural materials would have. On the left wrist bone, still attached by decomposed soft tissue, was a watch. The forensic technician carefully removed it and examined the back, where an engraving was still visible despite 4 years in the soil. To Marcus, love, Elena. Brennan felt something break open in her chest, a wave of grief so intense it was physical. The wallet was found near what had been the right hip pocket. The leather rotted and falling apart, but the contents partially preserved. Inside was a driver's license, the photo showing Marcus Chen's face smiling at the camera and several credit cards, all bearing his name. There was no question about identity. The remains belonged to Marcus Chen, missing delivery driver, husband, father, the man who'd disappeared on the 14th of November 2019 and whose absence had haunted this community for 4 years. Dr. Patricia Henshaw, the medical examiner, conducted a preliminary assessment at the scene. She estimated, based on the degree of decomposition, soil conditions, and insect evidence, that the body had been here since shortly after Marcus's disappearance. The timeline matched. The soil samples, when analyzed, would likely support it. Everything pointed to Marcus having been buried here within hours or days of vanishing, which meant he'd been lying in this field the entire time search teams had been looking for him. But as Dr. Henshaw examined the positioning of the remains, she pointed out something that changed everything. The skeleton was curled slightly on its side, arms crossed over the chest, in a shallow grave that had clearly been dug by human hands. The soil displacement pattern indicated intentional burial, not a natural depression or collapse. The grave was roughly oval-shaped, approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, dug to a consistent depth. This wasn't a panicked attempt to hide a body by someone who'd stumbled upon it. This wasn't an accident or a natural occurrence. This was deliberate. Someone had killed Marcus Chen. Someone had transported his body 400 feet into this cornfield, dug a grave, and buried him, while search teams were actively looking for him in the surrounding area. The boldness of it was staggering. The knowledge required knowing where search teams had already looked, knowing how deep to dig to avoid detection, knowing this field well enough to navigate it in darkness, pointed to someone with intimate familiarity with the location. But under cross-examination from Rachel Morrison, Brenneman's testimony began to crack. Morrison pressed him on specifics. What time exactly had he found the body? Where precisely had it been lying? What had Marcus been wearing? How long had it taken to dig the grave? Brenneman's answers were vague, contradictory, changing slightly with each question. His demeanor turned hostile, his voice rising, accusing Morrison of twisting his words. When Morrison asked why an innocent man would bury a body instead of calling 911, Brenneman's response was rambling and defensive, insisting she didn't understand what it was like to have a record, to be targeted by police, to know you'd be blamed regardless of the truth. Morrison asked about the burner phone. Brenneman claimed he'd bought it for personal use, didn't remember why, maybe wanted a separate number for work contacts. When Morrison pointed out he'd never activated the phone, never used it for any calls except the one text sent to Marcus Chen, Brenneman said he'd changed his mind, decided he didn't need it. The explanations felt hollow, rehearsed, and the jury's faces showed skepticism. The trial continued for 3 weeks. Witness after witness, expert after expert. Forensic analysts testified about the button match, the soil composition, the hyoid bone fracture. Dr. Patricia Henshaw explained in clinical detail how strangulation worked, how much force was required, how long it took for death to occur. Dale Richter testified about Brenneman's employment, his access to the field, his familiarity with the property. Elena Chen testified about Marcus, about his character, about the impossibility of him being involved in anything that would lead to violence. Detective Brennan testified about the investigation, the 4 years of dead ends, the discovery of the body, and the evidence that followed. Then, on June 24, the prosecution called their final witness, Travis McKenna, 38, a former cellmate of Kyle Brenneman from a brief 2022 jail stint. Brenneman had been arrested for DUI in March 2022, spent 10 days in the Black Hawk County Jail, and shared a cell with McKenna, who was serving time for probation violation. McKenna had been granted immunity from any charges related to his testimony in exchange for coming forward with what he'd heard. McKenna testified that Brenneman, drunk on contraband alcohol that inmates had brewed from fruit and sugar, had become angry and talkative one night in their cell. He'd ranted about police, about being targeted, about getting away with things they'd never prove. And then, in a moment of drunken bravado, he'd said something McKenna had never forgotten. He'd put a problem in the ground years ago near Cedar Falls. When McKenna asked what he meant, Brenneman had described it as some delivery guy who got in my business. McKenna had thought Brenneman was just talking tough, making up stories the way inmates sometimes did, but when news broke about Marcus Chen's body being found in November 2023, McKenna recognized the connection and contacted prosecutors. The defense attacked McKenna's credibility viciously. Patricia Wolf pointed out his criminal record, his immunity deal, the fact that he had every incentive to lie for leniency. She called it jailhouse hearsay, the least reliable form of testimony, words supposedly spoken in private with no recording, no verification, no way to prove they'd been said at all. But McKenna remained calm under cross-examination, insisting he was telling the truth because it was the right thing to do, because a man was dead and his family deserved justice. The jury's faces changed during McKenna's testimony. The skepticism that had lingered through some of the circumstantial evidence hardened into something else, belief, or at least the tipping point toward conviction. Here was Brenneman's own voice, secondhand but damning, admitting to putting someone in the ground near Cedar Falls. The specificity of delivery guy was too precise to be coincidence. Closing arguments took place on June 26. Rachel Morrison stood before the jury and connected every piece of evidence into a narrative of premeditated murder. The burner phone purchased 2 days before, the text that lured Marcus into the field, the strangulation that followed, the burial that concealed the crime for 4 years, and the confession to a cellmate that revealed the truth. Michael Santos and Patricia Wolfe argued reasonable doubt, insisted the prosecution's case was built on assumptions and unreliable witnesses, but their arguments felt defensive, reactive, insufficient against the weight of accumulated evidence. The jury deliberated for 6 days, a length of time that made everyone nervous. Long deliberations could mean anything: deep disagreement, careful consideration, or a single holdout refusing to convict. Brennan spent those 6 days barely sleeping, checking her phone constantly, waiting for the call that would tell her whether 4.5 years of work had resulted in justice or acquittal. Elena spent the time in prayer and therapy, surrounded by family, trying to prepare herself for either outcome. On the 3rd of July 2024, at 2:47 p.m., the jury foreman announced they'd reached a verdict. The courtroom reconvened, packed even tighter than during the trial, every journalist and community member fighting for space. Kyle Brenneman was led in wearing his ill-fitting suit, his face pale and drawn. The judge asked the foreman to read the verdict. The foreman, a retired teacher named Margaret Holloway, stood and read in a clear, steady voice, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle Brenneman, guilty of murder in the 2nd degree." The courtroom erupted. Elena collapsed into sobs, her body shaking with relief and grief and the release of 4.5 years of unbearable tension. Family members hugged her, held her, whispered that Marcus could finally rest. Brennan sat in her seat and exhaled, a breath she felt like she'd been holding since the 14th of November 2019, her eyes closing briefly as the weight lifted from her shoulders. Kyle Brenneman was led away screaming his innocence, insisting the jury had gotten it wrong, that he was being framed, his voice echoing through the courtroom until the bailiffs removed him. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. The judge, a stern woman named Judith Carmichael, who'd presided with firm control throughout the trial, sentenced Kyle Brenneman to 50 years in prison without possibility of parole. She spoke directly to him, telling him he'd taken a good man's life, had caused immeasurable suffering to a family, had buried the truth for 4 years and shown no genuine remorse. The sentence was the maximum allowed for 2nd-degree murder in Iowa, and Judge Carmichael made clear she believed every year was justified. In the aftermath, as summer turned toward fall, Detective Sarah Brennan drove out to County Road 47 one last time. The field where Marcus Chen had been buried had been returned to Dale Richter, who decided to plant soybeans instead of corn, unable to shake the association between cornfields and the body he'd found. The grave had been filled in, the soil leveled, and new crops were growing over the spot where Marcus had lain hidden for 4 years. Brennan stood at the edge of the field in the late afternoon light, thinking about randomness, about the terrible coincidence of Marcus stopping to help someone at precisely the wrong moment. There was no grand conspiracy, no sinister plot, no elaborate criminal enterprise, just a desperate man with a violent streak who'd lured a helpful stranger into a dark field, killed him in a moment of rage or panic, and buried the evidence. Marcus Chen had died because he was kind, because he stopped to help, because he crossed paths with Kyle Brenneman on a November evening when everything went wrong. The randomness of it was almost unbearable. A minute earlier or later, a different route, a decision not to respond to that text, any of those things would have saved Marcus's life. But fate, or chance, or bad luck had aligned in the worst possible way, and a good man had died. Elena Chen moved forward in the months that followed, though moving forward felt like walking through thick mud, exhausting and slow. She established a small scholarship fund in Marcus's name, providing financial support for children of missing persons who were trying to pursue education while dealing with the trauma and uncertainty of a parent's disappearance. It was a small legacy, but it meant something, kept Marcus's memory alive in a way that helped others. Lily, now 9 years old, visited her father's grave regularly. Marcus had been buried properly in Cedar Falls Memorial Cemetery, with a headstone that read, "Marcus Chen, beloved husband and father, 1990 to 2019. Elena and Lily brought flowers every Sunday, sat on the grass, and talked to him. Lily told him about school, about soccer, about the books she was reading. She couldn't remember his face without photos anymore, but she remembered the feeling of being loved by him, and that was enough. The Cedar Falls community memorialized Marcus as a man who disappeared into the unknown and, through stubborn investigation and a farmer's tiller, had finally been brought home. A small plaque was placed in the town square, honoring his service as a delivery driver and acknowledging the tragedy of his death. People remembered him when they saw FedEx trucks, when they drove past County Road 47, when they thought about how fragile life was and how quickly it could be taken. The story ended not with poetic resolution or triumphant justice, but with exhausted closure. The cornfield grew again each year, indifferent to human tragedy, following the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest that had defined Iowa for generations. The soil that had hidden Marcus Chen's body for 4 years now produced soybeans, the land moving forward because that's what land does. But the people remembered. Elena remembered. Lily remembered. Detective Brennan remembered. The community of Cedar Falls remembered. Justice had been served, delayed by 4 years and imperfect in its ability to restore what was lost, but served nonetheless. Kyle Brenneman would spend the rest of his life in prison, and Marcus Chen's family would spend the rest of theirs living with his absence. There was no way to balance that equation, no way to make it fair or right. But the truth had been unearthed from the soil where Marcus had been stolen. And sometimes, in cases like this, truth was the only form of justice possible. Marcus Chen's final delivery was completed, not the birthday package for the Holloways that had sat undelivered in his truck, but the delivery of truth, of answers, of closure to the people who'd loved him and searched for him and refused to let him be forgotten. He came home not in life, but in memory, in justice, in the small scholarship bearing his name, in the Sunday visits to his grave where his daughter told him about her life. The cornfield remained, indifferent and eternal, but the people who'd known Marcus Chen carried his story forward, ensuring that his disappearance into the November darkness would not be the end of his legacy, but rather a terrible chapter in a larger story of love, loss, persistence, and the stubborn human refusal to let the dead be forgotten.